Hi everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Cochrane Doctrine with me, Eric Cochrane. Please hit like and subscribe to my channel down below. This is really becoming a new hobby of mine. I am also absolutely loving my new Apple MacBook computer. So, if you have not watched my previous vlog, I would encourage you to do so. It certainly feeds into what I'm going to be discussing today. I went into all the details and facts previously about how it is truly the Democratic Party, which has been the party of oppression, from the era of slavery all the way up to the opposition of civil rights. I know facts are the left's worst enemy, and today I'm going to be tearing up what many of them like referring to as the Southern Strategy. For starters, PragerU did a very well-made video where Professor Carol Swain tore this issue apart, which I'm going to dig even more in depth into. As an Atlanta native who witnessed much of the changes the South underwent in the last 40 years, I can speak for it firsthand. But let's begin with what Professor Swain did discuss. Richard Nixon, one of our most corrupt presidents ever, who I admit was a Republican, is said to have created the Southern Strategy. Appeal to the racists in the South to help win presidential elections. During the 1960s, as our nation was polarized over the civil rights movement, the Deep South voted for Republican Barry Goldwater in 1964, who opposed Article 2 of the Civil Rights Act, and then staunch segregationalist George Wallace in 1968. Nixon won his landslide victory in 1972, carrying every state but Massachusetts. As far back as the 1928 election, Herbert Hoover won 47% of the South's popular vote. I had mentioned in my last video that Johnson was the first president in a century our country elected who had been from a state that seceded during the Civil War, and that his status as a Southern Democrat was pivotal in helping Kennedy win the much-needed South as his running mate. All through the 1960s, Democrats dominated Southern congressional seats and state governorships. The landmark 1964 Civil Rights Act, which passed under the Johnson administration and with a Democratic supermajority, it should be noted that the votes were 73 to 27 in the Senate and 290 to 130 in the House. What people don't realize, though, is that over 80% of the Republican minority voted in favor. Only 6 out of 33 Republican senators and 34 out of 182 Republican representatives voted against it. On the contrary, 21 out of 67 Democratic senators and 96 out of 248 Democratic representatives voted against it. So of all the votes which attempted to strike it down, 75% were Democrats. All 21 Democratic senators who voted against it were in the South. How many of these senators became Republicans? The answer is 1. The other 20 remained Democrats and were replaced by other Democrats. One of these Southern Democratic senators who voted against it was Tennessee Senator Albert Gore Sr., who, you guessed it, was the father of future Democratic Tennessee Senator, Vice President, and presidential hopeful Albert Gore Jr., if that should tell you anything. In the 1976 presidential election, America elected its second president since the Civil War hailing from another Confederate state. Georgia Governor Jimmy Carter, who of course swept the Deep South, and another Democrat, just like Johnson a decade earlier. The next three elections, 1980, 84, and 88, would be landslide Republican victories. The first two for Reagan, and in 88 for Bush 41. Today, for the last nearly 30 years, what are the Democratic Party strongholds on the electoral map? Illinois, New York, and of course, California. For the last half century, New York has been the most reliably Democratic state. From 1964 to 1992, California and Illinois were solidly Republican states. Starting in 1992, that changed. Who did the country elect that year? Arkansas Governor Bill Clinton, another Southern Democrat. His running mate? Senator Al Gore Jr. of Tennessee. Now, for the first time in 130 years, our nation elected both a president and vice president from the former Confederacy. Again, both of the same party which seceded from the Union. In 1992, the Clinton-Gore ticket, of course, won Arkansas and Tennessee, along with Louisiana, Kentucky, and Georgia. In 1996, they won all those states again, except Georgia, but picked up Florida. Having said that, as close and controversial as the 2000 election was, with Florida being the center of controversy, we know this much. Gore did not win his own home state of Tennessee, and Clinton let him down further, failing to win him Arkansas. One or the other, both of which they won in the last two elections, would have secured Gore's victory, regardless of Florida. In all fairness, the Democratic Party remained strong in the Deep South well into the end of the 20th century. It was not until the 1980s the gradual shift began, that by 1994 most congressional seats had been replaced by Republicans, as in California they had been replaced by Democrats. And it was not until 2000 when Republicans were dominant across the South, i.e., filling most congressional seats, most governorships, and solidly red in the Electoral College. If California could go from Republican to Democrat in this time frame, why is it hard to believe the South went the other way? I'll explain why the South has changed into a Republican stronghold. First and foremost is how much the South has increased in population with outsiders. At the turn of the 20th century, 120 years ago, America was transitioning from an urban society following the Gilded Age. By the mid-20th century, after World War II, the advent of automobiles and interstate highways marked the start of suburbia. And with it came one of our largest generations ever, the first of whom largely grew up in suburbs, the baby boomers. By the late 1960s, when the first baby boomers began maturing into adulthood, there was a huge internal migration, the rise of the Sun Belt. After the Jim Crow laws were abolished and home air conditioning improved, people who had grown up north moved south, seeking warmer living conditions and lower costs of living. By the 1980s, cheaper overhead and lower taxes started pushing industry and corporations south as well. If you watched my pilot episode, I am a living example of a millennial whose baby boomer parents did exactly that. They grew up in the suburbs of Washington, D.C., married, and moved to Atlanta in the late 1980s. Between 1980 and 2000, the metro Atlanta area more than doubled in population. By the 1996 Centennial Olympics, Atlanta Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport was the busiest airport in the world, and to this day still is. My parents and I left Atlanta in 2003, and it still has not stopped growing. Might I remind you all that once again, I had attended Catholic elementary school from kindergarten through 3rd grade. The Catholic Archdiocese of Atlanta grew enormously while I was growing up there. Excuse me. There were several Catholic elementary schools that opened in Atlanta during the 1990s because so many Catholic parents who had moved to Atlanta wanted Catholic education for their kids. Looking back, most of my Catholic elementary school friends were like me. Their parents had grown up elsewhere and moved to Atlanta. One of my closest friends there had been born in Chicago and moved to Atlanta before starting kindergarten. Another one of our close families was from California. Another friend's parents had moved from Wisconsin. My 1st grade teacher had recently moved to Atlanta from Cleveland, Ohio. Speaking of that, there were 2 families with kids my age in our Marietta neighborhood who'd moved to Atlanta from Ohio. Both Catholic, if I might add. And furthermore, not just the Catholic Archdiocese, but Atlanta's Jewish community grew significantly in that time frame as well. Similar growth trends could be seen in other major metro areas within the Deep South starting after 1980. Just like Atlanta, Charlotte, North Carolina, Metrolina more than doubled in population as well within that time frame. The Dallas-Fort Worth area nearly doubled in size to become the largest metro area in the South and also home to one of the world's busiest airports along with Atlanta's. Houston grew over 50% and Nashville grew nearly 50%. Florida was the 7th most populous state according to the 1980 census. By 2000, it was the 4th. This was the growth of the Sun Belt, ladies and gentlemen. Why is the modern-day South now the nation's haven for conservatives and the Republican Party? Because our Republican Party values have helped us grow for the past 40 years, power to the states, lower taxes, and the free market have served us well and once again attracted outsiders. They still are, especially after COVID this past year. Apart from that, at this point, most of us in the South still hold true to biblical values which progressivism/modern-day liberalism has come into conflict with. And to top it all off, we love guns. Values have changed in the South as they have changed elsewhere in the country. The Southern strategy is just a leftist argument for exonerating the modern Democratic Party for being the party of slavery, segregation, and civil rights opposition, while at the same time losing which for over a century was their most loyal stronghold. I'm Eric Cochran. Thanks for watching. Until next time.